They may be called the next generation, but they're the church of today. Reach, disciple, and mobilize students to share the hope of the gospel. This is the GenSend podcast with Shane Pruitt, Paul Worcester, and Lacey Villasenor.
Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the GenSend podcast. Been an incredible season so far, and I am uber pumped about this conversation today. The moment we decided to talk about this and who was going to come on and talk to us about it, as well as a friend, as a guest, I couldn't wait. I've had this particular conversation circled, and we're going to talk about cultural apologetics. What does that even mean? It's kind of a hot cliche kind of word topic. What does that mean? Why is it important? And I can't think of someone better to bring on than our friend Trevin Wax. Trevin Wax is the Vice President of Research and Resource Development at the North American Mission Board. He's an author, podcaster, visiting professor at Cedarville University, a great school, columnist for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. He is also a follower of Jesus, a father, a husband, and the smartest guy I know. Which I don't know if that's really saying much, but he is the smartest guy I know. So I actually looked this up the other day. So a 130 and beyond is like really the genius threshold for the IQ. So 130 and beyond is the genius threshold for the IQ. So Trevin, welcome to the GenSend podcast. I want to know, have you ever done an IQ test? What's your IQ?
I have never done an IQ test that I know of. And if I'm the smartest person, you know, you've got to get out more, Shane. You've got to get out more.
That's right. Yeah. Paul, true or false? You are smarter than Trevin. Is that a true statement or false statement? Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Lacey,
I should have included. I don't know my IQ, but I should have. We should have included that he's also a Narnia enthusiast. I was going to say Narnia nerd, but enthusiast sounds more flattering, so I'm saying enthusiast.
Nerd is a fine description too. You know,
that actually had a pretty good little flow. Narnia nerd.
Yeah, that's right.
To me, that'd be a cool T-shirt. You know.
Well, I'm super excited to pick Trevin's brain today about how we can help the next generation kind of engage with a lot of the popular ideologies that have seeped into our culture without being actually influenced by them. And so I'd love to just start here. Trevin, why don't you start us off? What are some of the most impactful ideologies that you guys are seeing influencing the next generation, whether good or bad?
Well, you know, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, I don't know that any of us can actually escape being influenced at some level by our culture and by different ideologies that are out there, because, you know, it's kind of like when we talk about culture, it's kind of the water that we're swimming in. So I think what's important is for us to try to filter through and not and allow certain aspects of what it is that we're encountering, to make sure that what is toxic or not good about our culture doesn't get through, as much as we can filter it out. And what is good and healthy and life-giving is something that we can have and we can benefit from. But I think some of the big challenges when we look at, you know, our generation, the next generation, some of the main things that I think would be taken as common sense these days, one would be an idea of freedom as freedom from constraints rather than being free within the right constraints. So it's like basically like the idea of freedom in your life is I need to basically, I've got to be my own person, right? And so I've got to be free from these obligations or these strictures that other people are going to place on me. And I've got to be able to chart my own course, right? And be free from all of this, you know, this stuff that would hold me back. But there's not really a lot of conversation about what we're free for, like free to pursue what is true and good and beautiful, like the right restraints that help us become the kind of people that pursue that kind of freedom. So I think that is a big thing in our society. And another one would be the idea of just being true to yourself, like that being the purpose of life, to look inside, to find and discover yourself by your deepest desires, and then to express that to the world and expect everyone to cheer you on. You know, I think that's a big one. The idea that just my truth is my truth and your truth is your truth, and religion is just more of a preference kind of a thing, rather than than being, something that is objectively true, that is like true for everybody. I think a lot of people put religion in the category of, well, this just helps your life better in some way, be better in some way. So when we talk about religion, we're talking about preferences. We're talking about like ice cream flavors. We're talking about spiritual practices that may or may not help you in some level, but not actually something that is like objectively like true. And so I think those are some aspects. And I mean, and then there's also, I'll just throw in one more, because sort of the individualism that comes with a be true to yourself mindset leaves a lot of people feeling lonely.
Yeah.
There's more and more of a push to identify ourselves with groups, right? With tribes, whether we're identifying ourselves or seeing ourselves as fundamentally marked by, as like the most important thing about us is like our ethnicity or our, sexual orientation or our, whatever, tribe or political persuasion we are, or whatever it might be, like finding certain characteristics and saying that, like, I find my identity within this particular group and whatever this group thinks and whatever this group's, motivations are. And so a lot of people are gravitating, I think, especially because individualism leaves you feeling lonely, you gravitate toward a group and then the group becomes the main part of your identity. So we're seeing that as well. So I don't know. That's just a few I think that we can see. I don't know what you guys would say if you see those as well, or there's something I'm leaving out.
Yes, no, I would even double down on that whole finding your identity in a group thing. And that can be even something so small as the type of music you listen to, a hobby or anime or whatever. I like this series of whatever it is. And they can kind of like form little groups around that. And that becomes a major part of someone's identity is, you fill in the blank of what that is. And that's a trend I've seen, and it almost can get to an unhealthy place if we're not careful, is like, I'm this. And so there has always been an aspect of that where you have the jocks or the skaters or whatever. But I think there's even something more with the media and the way it is now that it's almost probably accelerated, perhaps. So that's one. Yeah,
and I just add to that. I mean, that's a really good point. I would add to that. I read recently an article in the New Yorker about sort of controversies over the DSM, which is the kind of the Bible or the textbook for all of the psychiatric disorders that are out there. And there's been a proliferation of different maladies that have been named over the last 50 years or so, right? But some of those maladies, they're like actually subsets of other maladies. And so they've been like trying to, kind of peel back and take away some of those titles and some of those names. But there's a lot of controversy around that because in a society where people are trying to find and express and identify themselves, a lot of people have latched on to, certain disorders when it comes to psychiatry or certain maladies as sort of constituting their own identity. So as soon as you say, well, actually, we don't think that this malady actually exists the way that we had the title for it, so we're just going to put it as a subset on this other thing, it creates all this controversy because people are identifying themselves with, this particular tic or this particular disorder or this particular, whatever it might be. And they're explaining major aspects of their life around that disorder as like it being one of the defining characteristics of who they are. So, and so you go back and forth with like, even, questions of like, are you a person with autism or are you autistic? Right. What is your, some say, I want to identify as this. Other people are saying, no, that's not like the core of my being. That's just something that does mark or that I wrestle with. Right. So it was a fascinating article that, in a secular publication where they were wrestling with this sort of the way that people are grasping for all kinds of things to be core to their identity as they try to find themselves in the world that we live in.
Yeah, so true. And as you're talking, Trevin, and great input, Paul, just like there's so many layers to this, because I feel like there is this, even more than I can really remember in my lifetime, this tribalism, right? Where everybody's kind of, hey, I'm gonna rally around this tribe, and then anything that disagrees with this tribe is not only, oh man, we just disagree. They're like dangerous. They're toxic. They're bigoted. They're archaic, or so individualistic that I want everything to adjust around me, because I'm so individualistic. So it's like, hey, like you said, Trevin, and we hear a lot of that, right? Hey, the greatest good is to live your truth, to find your authentic self. And then when you determine by your own estimation of what that is, then everything's got to adjust around you, which I think is probably a lot of the root of where all these other things stem from, because I think easily we'll go, all right, what are some of the major cultural influences? I think it's easy to go LGBTQIA+, it's easy to go self-help, it's easy to go moral relativism, it's easy to go, even maybe political idolatry. You talk about that's relevant this year, but a lot of it is really just almost like self-worship. It kind of goes back to the garden, right? Where the major temptation was not, hey, eat this apple. First of all, we don't know if it was an apple. It just says fruit. But really the fruit was the fruit of the real temptation, which is you can know good and evil and be like God. That was the ultimate temptation, right? You be God. You determine, and everything must adjust around you. I even saw a couple of weeks ago, and then I shared it on my social media, of where somebody kind of wrote a review into 23andMe. So 23andMe that does like DNA testing, right? Like, so you can find out what your genetic makeup is, your background, your ancestry, and everything. And this person's friend that they bought this for as a gift was really offended because they were a male identifying as a female, but when their DNA came back as male, that person was really offended. So they were asking 23andMe how they were going to adjust to really be able to identify with the trans community. So what that's meaning is your truth, your authentic self, means science and biology and everything must adjust to that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. We did 23andMe as well. And when I think about that, that's actually that's just data, right? It's just scientific data. And it's telling you, from where your ancestors come from, really. It's not really saying much more than that.
Right.
But what's fascinating is that it doesn't always line up with the way people think about their history or their identity.
Exactly.
And they would rather shape the actual facts to fit what they want. But but don't you think that that's part of, I think it is an indication of self-worship, but the reason we get into that sort of self-worship in the first place is because we have these, as Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Like we're yearning for being grounded in something. We're yearning for relationship. We're yearning for God, but then it's misdirected and we turn in on ourselves. And I think that's the key thing to all of the things that we've talked about. There's reasons why we get misdirected and then we turn in on ourselves rather than looking up to God.
Oh yeah. Oh, 100, and I think of John Calvin, he said, our heart is an idol factory, constantly pumping out new idols to worship, because that's what I tell young people all the time is you don't even have to learn how to worship. Worship is natural for you. It's part of you being made in the image of God. You were created to worship him, but because of the fall, we're natural worshipers. The question is not if you're worshiping, you are worshiping. The question is always who or what are you worshiping, for sure.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, I think there's this underlying, factor where it's people want an explanation for the brokenness they've experienced in their own lives or that they see in the world around them. And then they search for, a solution to that brokenness. And it always, unless they're finding it and, looking to Jesus, it's always going to lead to some kind of idol or something that doesn't actually solve the issue, but probably creates more issues, actually. Paul Gold defines cultural apologetics, so we're kind of diving into today, as the work of establishing the Christian voice, conscience, and imagination within a culture so that Christianity can actually be seen as true and satisfying. I love that. I love the way you put that. I think that's so beautiful. How can we kind of do this for the next generation, Trevin? How can we help students kind of even begin to do this among their own generation?
The title Cultural Apologetics is it's really interesting because there's no such thing as apologetics that's not cultural at some level. Like every time we're making a defense of the gospel or we're making a case, trying to persuade people to consider the truth claims of Christianity, we're doing that within a cultural context. And we're usually appealing to some kind of argument that we think is going to be effective, right? So all apologetics at some level are cultural. I think when we talk about cultural apologetics as opposed to just traditional apologetics, we're actually talking about, I like to use the illustration of different golf clubs in the golf bag. we're talking about using some of the clubs we haven't used quite as often, but could be really effective depending on the person you're talking to. So, you can make your traditional claims of Christianity and say, hey, here are the reasons to believe, the world appears like it's been designed, right? There's all these different kinds of arguments you can make for the existence of God or for the historical reliability of the gospels or the resurrection of Jesus and whatnot. And all of those are vital and really important. Cultural apologetics comes alongside those, not to replace them, but to say, we've got to figure out ways of presenting the Christian faith so that people, even if they don't believe in Christianity yet, they would want it to be true. Like they would hear the story, they would so resonate with it, maybe through art, maybe through music, maybe through the way that we're telling a story, or the way we're actually helping someone narrate their own story within the bigger story of God, to where the thirst for Christianity, for Jesus Christ, would be heightened rather than quenched or temporarily satisfied in the polluted wells of the world. Like that's what cultural apologetics is getting at. It's wanting to make Christianity plausible for someone who hasn't really given much thought to some of the claims of the Christian faith. And so I think the way that we have to do that is we have to be really good and attentive listeners. Yeah. Like one of the things cultural apologetics is doing is asking the question that Jesus asks the disciples in John when he asks the question, "What are you seeking?" There's a couple of other places in the Gospels where Jesus asks the disciples, "What do you want from me? What do you want?" He asks the question of the paralyzed man who's in the pool there that is not able to get down. He asked the question, "Do you want to be healed?" Like, do you want? Notice that consistently Jesus is asking questions about what you want. Like, what is the driving desire, the love that's sort of driving who you are as a person? These are questions that Jesus is asking. And then he responds by saying, "Come and see." Right? He tells the disciple, come with me where I'm saying, come and see. And so I think cultural apologetics is not, it goes beyond trying to win an argument or to make just a persuasive knockdown, drag out case. Nobody really at the end of the day is argued into the kingdom of God. The arguments can bolster faith or can take away from faith or can help faith, but arguments are not the main thing. Rational arguments are not the main thing. The main thing is when you're able to connect. John Perkins, a civil rights leader, used to say really good evangelism is when you connect the good news of Jesus Christ with people's deepest yearnings. Yeah. And you're able to understand what those yearnings are, you really have to listen to people. Yeah. It's not so much about talking or having all the right answers to be able to kind of walk through and win an argument. There's a time and a place for great dialogue and debate. Right. A lot of a cultural apologetics is really being attentive to the person in front of you, seeing what it is they really want, and then taking those wants, those things that you hear, and putting them within the context of a story in which Jesus is the answer. He is the solution to what it is that they're looking for.
That's so good. Yeah, and I think, I love that golf club illustration. And then maybe that's why my golf game is so bad. There's some clubs out there that I haven't used yet that would really help me. I love that. But that illustration is spot on. And, I've heard Paul say this before, and we've talked about it before, is a lot of times people come to faith. When you were saying that, Trevin, I was thinking of this. A lot of times people come to faith in transitions or trouble. So meaning like a shift in their life, right? Leaving high school to go off to college, and they're seeking some community, they're seeking answers, they're seeking truth, or some kind of suffering taking place in their life. And so to really even know that story and how to point them to the gospel, you got to listen what is going on in their life. And I found even personally, sometimes the reason someone says they're an atheist or they're really struggling with God or their church is a lot of times through hurt and pain. They may have scientific answers, but that's not what got them, there. Usually it started with pain or letdown, and then it led down a path of now I can justify why I don't believe in God by these scientific excuses or whatever. But yeah, usually some kind of transition or trouble in their life, and to listen. And I think this is such an important conversation. I know, Trevin, you and I've talked about this before, is, being around college students and young adults or teenagers. Rarely do I get the question anymore. I still do, but it's rare. Do I get the question anymore of like, hey, my friend's a Muslim. How do I reach them with the gospel? Or my friend's a Buddhist. How do I reach them with the gospel? Rarely do I get those questions anymore, but almost daily, you get those questions. Hey, my friend is identifying as non-binary, or my friend is identifying as pansexual, or my friend is struggling with mental and emotional health. And so, I just started using the term cultural apologetics. I don't know if that's right or not, but I feel like that is the question that people are asking. Rarely is it defending your faith with other religions and talking to people of other religions. It's really just this kind of cultural belief in these things that are heightened around them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I like to call it it's the rise of pseudo-religions and like pseudo-spiritualities, like different kinds of, I mean, this is the thing, like people are not really, I know we like to talk about how the world is really quickly secularizing. And there's some truth to that in the United States, if you, based on kind of certain metrics you look at. But you'll find that people are actually a lot of people are still very superstitious. A lot of people that are not religious still say that they believe in God. A lot of people are open to all kinds of various spirituality kind of things. I mean, I think about all the sort of various gospels out there, right? Like the gospel of wellness. Whether it's mental wellness, physical wellness, whatever, I mean, the language around that, like toxins and positivity and like eliminate, like do this or like mindfulness routines and whatnot. Like you've got a lot of, there's this seeking for an inner peace that's going to be expressed mentally and physically. Or you can think of, there's like almost a neo-stoic kind of gospel that's out there. You think of like Ryan Holiday or Jocko Willink, and you think of even kind of he's more influenced by like Jungian philosophy, but like the Jordan Peterson phenomenon and whatnot, especially with a lot of young men, like the idea of I've got to like step up and I've got to like perfect my body and I've got to take on this sacrifices and, take on this, burden. And there's good and bad in all of this. It's just, you're watching some of these, for some people, social justice and like intersectionality, it is a religion. It's like it's like a fervent religion. You've got the world was like this, then there was the fall because of, Christianity or capitalism or whatever it might be. And then this is going to be the rise up. And then this is what it's going to look like, except it's it's less about the sort of class distinctions that you got from like from like Marx. And it's more, either race or gender or sexuality, other kinds of things. So, but you put all of these things together and you can see why, in a world where Christianity is on the decline, people are grasping for other kinds of causes or worldviews or philosophies or practices that they think are going to bring some of that fulfillment that used to come about through their religious community or through their religious beliefs or whatnot. And so I think it's just really important for us to be attuned to that and to recognize that people are in all sorts of stages, even in our churches, a lot of times are remixing and like matching, just kind of like putting together like they're cobbling together this own sort of personal, it's like this big stew. Everybody just throws stuff in and you gotta like, you gotta recognize that is normal and that's happening all over the place. And we could spend all day long just like railing against the falsehoods in sort of, the wellness stuff or in the neo-stoicism or in some of the, the extremes of social justice ideology or whatever. But at the end of the day, you've got to recognize you got to ask the question, what is the deeper longing that is leading people to kind of walk these paths so that you can actually not only expose lies when they are there, but also fulfill those deeper longings that lead them to believe the lies in the first place.
Amen.
That's good.
That's so good.
Campus ministry leaders, I was at a kind of gathering of different networks of collegiate leaders, top level leaders from different organizations. If I named them, you would recognize them. But one of those groups basically said the question a lot of students are asking is not necessarily what's true, but what is beautiful. And that's a really interesting kind of like, and so they even shaped how they approach gospel conversations, apologetics. And in that beautiful sense, also kind of like what works, what is satisfying, what is something that's going to fulfill me. That's kind of underneath that beautiful idea there. And so that's really fascinating. As we're teaching, as we're preparing, we still need to hold tight to the truth and proclaim that, but also in our kind of the way we're presenting it, have that in mind. If what is beautiful, what works, what is satisfying. And when you think about it, the Gospel of John, Jesus uses a lot of great metaphors, a lot of great illustrations and things that kind of speak to that longing of the rivers of living water and things like that. And so we found, even going through the Gospel of John with a college student that's seeking or interested in faith, can be a great way. Even just studying it in a small investigative Bible study can be a great way to, because there's nothing more compelling than Jesus, right? There's
Absolutely.
nothing more exciting than Jesus. And so that's just kind of a boots on the ground kind of things, that conversations we're having along these lines. So.
Yeah, Trevin, you mentioned this earlier, but I read that article where you talked about that common phrase of living my truth or speaking my truth, and kind of how this has even impacted conversations around religion and spirituality. And you talked about a shift towards privatized religion, which I thought was really interesting. Can you share a little bit about the danger of that shift and kind of how we can even combat that in the next generation?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the result of the Enlightenment, actually. So this is going centuries back. So you can't really look to anyone just recently and said, oh, we've just gone, this is why this is the way it is. I mean, we're the certain sort of cultural weather phenomenon that we experience now are because of major, like bigger things that are going on in the atmosphere that we may not even be aware of. But, the Enlightenment split religion, like split truth and values, basically. Like there's religion's more the realm of values, and science is really the realm of truth. Well, that was always really reductionist. And so, but over time, a lot of people have adopted this idea that religion is, the most important thing about religion is to make you a good moral person, right? And to help your life in some way. Like what works for you is what works for you, and it's good. But it's basically, it's not true at the level of like, this is, Jesus Christ is raised from the dead and is Lord of the world for everybody. Like, that's not what we're talking about. Jesus is Lord for you, he's your only way, or that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so, because people just, and so you got to understand, if we're sharing the gospel today and we're talking to people about Jesus, they may hear us out because, like Paul said, like, Jesus is really compelling, but they may hear you out, but they're going to immediately assume when you talk about religion that you are basically talking about something that is private and personal and deeply meaningful for you. And you may be trying to convince them to try it for themselves, but they're not going to assume you're talking about this is the actual truth about the world. Like, they're going to assume you're inviting them into a personal, private experience that has worked well for you. And that's just how they're going to put religion, generally speaking, people put religion in that category. Now, obviously, most Muslims do not do this. Most, Christians throughout history have not done this. So it's not everybody does this, but a lot of just generally more secular minded, spiritually minded, secular people as well, just kind of put Christianity in that privatized, personalized box. And, I will be one to say, I want to amen everything Paul said about starting with what is good and beautiful sometimes before you eventually get back to, this is actually, the reason it's good and beautiful is because it's also true. If you start with goodness and beauty and then you work your way back to truth, there are all kinds of ways into the house, into the castle of the kingdom. So there's all sorts of entrances. And I'm like, open all the entrances you can, put down every gate you can, right? Like, so I'd be definitely one to say, any place there's an open window, invite someone in whatever window it is. But at some level, when you get to that moment of conversion, you're helping someone cross a line where it's not just, this is helpful for me, or this is something I think is good, or this is something that's helpful for Western society, or this is something that's helpful culturally, or this is something beautiful. At some point, when you cross the threshold of true conversion, you're not simply saying this is true for me. You're also saying I believe this is the truth about the world. That's why we confess, the Apostles' Creed. I believe in Jesus Christ, God's only son, like we're saying this is what he did. He lived, he died, he rose again. He's coming to judge the living and the dead. Like these are things we believe and we confess, not just because they're helpful and beautiful and good, although they are all of those things, but because they're true. And so, at the end of the day, I'm not really interested in Christianity if it's merely helpful, because there's a lot of things that you may find helpful in the world. Right. The reason I think Christianity is ultimately helpful is because I believe it's actually true. Amen. And so at some point, you've got to get back to that truth question. Again, that may not be the starting point. And some traditional apologetics start there. Let me convince you that the resurrection really happened. Let me convince you that God exists. Here are the arguments. How do you respond to these? And to all of that, I want to be like, it's like the golf club thing. Like, hey, if someone's having that rational conversation with you, get the golf club ready. Like not to hit someone with it, obviously, but to like use whatever ball, use whatever club that you've got. But I realize a lot of the people we talk to today, that's not where they're starting. They're not starting with the question about the rationality of Christianity. They're just starting with the helpfulness or the benefit or the beauty or the goodness of it. Like they're asking, is it moral? Is it good? Does it help society? Recently, we've seen a couple of like new atheist types who were either agnostic or atheist that were like vehemently atheist, come to faith in Christ, be converted, at least in part because they believe Western civilization cannot survive without Christianity. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not the reason to become a Christian, so you can save Western civilization.
Yeah.
It appears that some of these new atheists that have come over, that was their doorway in, which is an odd doorway, not one that we were used to 50 years ago, right? But I'm like, bring them in, like welcome them in, but then recognize eventually they're going to come to that place of recognizing Christianity is good, not just because it's beneficial, but because it's actually true.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we even had a guy in Chico, the church where we were part of. The reason he started coming to church was because Jordan Peterson's teachings from the Bible, he was really into all that. And then he came to church and we taught him the true gospel and he came to Christ and he's growing. But kind of that Jordan Peterson, God used that sort of interest in those sort of things to spark something. So that's kind of an interesting example.
Oh, totally. I mean, Jordan Peterson is fascinating. And the thing that's fascinating about him in my mind is he takes the Bible seriously.
Yep.
As a work of literature, as a work of art, as time tested, whether he believes that it's true in all sense, in the way that the Bible holds itself out to be true, remains to be seen. And he sometimes like kind of, around the existence of God and things, like he kind of gets all around. And there are times when I think, oh man, he's really close to the kingdom. And then there's other times I listen to him like talk about wrestling with God, for example, or like, like you as the individual taking on the burden on your shoulders and trudging up the hill. But at the end of the day, I'm almost like Jordan, that's an amped up moralism. At the end of the day, the most beautiful sight in the world is not that you have taken ownership and sacrifice and taken the burden on yourself and have trudged up the hill, but like Christian, the Pilgrim's Progress, you laid down the burden because Jesus took that burden up the hill when he went to Calvary. Like, it's just like, oh, he's so close.
He is so close.
So far, and so you kind of, but you see this, but what's fascinating is from all different kinds of angles, people are wrestling with the big questions of life. And that's something to lean into.
Yeah. Yeah, Trevin, I thought of two things when you were talking. Gosh, this is fascinating. I love this conversation. I feel like we could turn this into a series of podcast conversations. They're so good. Is, talking about, the guys that are like, oh, I became a Christian because that's what is good for Western, civilization is. One thing I've seen even shift, especially since the pandemic, is that our Christian universities and Christian private schools are a massive mission field now, because more and more parents are putting their kids in Christian private schools or sending them to Christian universities, not even because they're Christian, but because they think it's a safer place for their kids than a lot of public schools or maybe even a secular university. So I think that's a massive thing there. Even where I've shifted the last couple of years is every time I preach chapel at a private school or a Christian university, I ask if I can give an invitation, and every single time students respond because it's a massive mission field. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind too. And then the second thing I just thought about, even how individualistically we approach Christianity, go, oh, the reason I want to investigate this is because I like this aspect of it. One thing we've seen too in recent years is a shift of people approaching Jesus the same way, to where a lot of times, used to you could go, hey, are you a Christian? Are you a follower of Jesus? And they'd go, yeah. Man, I love Jesus. I worship Jesus. And you would kind of just leave it alone after that. But now I feel like you almost even have to continue to press that a little bit, because often the more and more people talk about their Jesus, for lack of a better term, the less and less he sounds like the Jesus of the Bible, right?
Yeah.
So it's sometimes a Jesus that's kind of shaped by their preferences, their opinions, their tolerances, right? Like my Jesus tolerates the lifestyles I tolerate. My Jesus would vote the way I vote. My Jesus would, get angry about the things I get angry about. My Jesus is passionate about that, the things I'm passionate about. And so if that's the Jesus whom we're worshiping is mainly shaped by our preferences, opinions, and tolerances, and not the Jesus of the Word of God, then on some level, again, it goes back to idolatry. All we do is create an idol named Jesus. And so I feel like more and more you even see that in the church and quote unquote Christian circles, is like the Jesus they believe is not necessarily the Jesus of the Word of God. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, there is something beautiful about saying my Jesus, right? Or Jesus calling us his own. Cause he belongs to us, we belong to him. Like I love there is a deeply personal, beautiful aspect to our relationship with Jesus Christ. And it's one of the evangelical emphases that I'm most thankful for. Sure. But you're right. In the kind of environment that we're in, that easily gets shifted into, we can use my Jesus language. And we're not talking about my relationship with the Jesus as he's unfolded in the scriptures.
Right.
We're talking about my Jesus as almost like kind of this like little decorative thing, like the life coach for my life kind of a thing.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's just so far from this. At the end of the day, he's our Savior King. Right. Yes. So like that, like we don't talk about when we talk about my King. That's better. Actually, I just wonder, and it's good to press in and to ask like what people mean by, what do you mean by that? What do you mean when you say this or that? And sometimes that's the best response, is just to ask questions, to probe a little deeper, to take that conversation down one more level. Yeah,
no doubt. I keep thinking of the cliche that was so popular years and years ago that was like, don't give me theology, just give me Jesus. And I understand some of that is like, sometimes we can get so cold with our doctrine and theology that there's not the fire of the Spirit there. But no, we need some good doctrine and theology when we're approaching, when we're talking about Jesus as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right, Shane. I'm sure we could keep talking for a long time. There's so many different topics we could kind of go into here, but let's just end here. The digital age, it's a hard time to disciple. And, a lot of people listening to this are next gen leaders, collegiate youth, wherever they land. But we often, they get students for maybe 1-2 hours a week. Meanwhile, those students are being formed by what they engage with online for 10 plus hours a week. And I would even say that's on the low end. I'm sure it's longer. So what are some ways that ministry leaders can approach discipleship in this digital age?
I think points of contact and communication are great, and recognizing that there's different, we do have more avenues at like just touch points, right? And so I think using those to the best of our ability is great. I think also recommending good resources and then talking over those resources with people. Like the one thing that we've talked about earlier, when we mentioned Jordan Peterson, the bar is really high when people are willing to listen for hours to someone expound on scripture. Yeah. So like, I want to like us as leaders to be like, we're going to have to like up the ante, like up our game here on how we are teaching and how deep we're willing to go. I don't mean like preaching on at a midweek service for hours and hours. You got to, but the students that want to go deep, you got to be able to continue to take them deeper and deeper. And they're not going to go deeper generally than you are going. So they're going to move on from you if you're not taking them into deep waters, if there's that hunger there. So I think utilizing the different touch points that we have in a digital age, but then also there is no better connection point in a world where so much of life is online than face-to-face interaction, like prioritizing flesh and blood, real relationships with, 2 or 3 students at a time at times, and like just good conversation, to where like that is going to be more rare, increasingly rare in our society. And so we as the church have got to preserve that, because there just so much of what's happening out in the world is isolated, and it's offline, and it's happening in isolated rooms and, through screens and whatnot. Facilitating and really prioritizing the face-to-face, though, is increasingly important in a world where so many people are going digital.
Yeah, so good. Yeah, and I would just quote what the great theologian Paul Worcester said recently. I heard on a podcast episode is the best stories win the day. And we got the greatest story of all time, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I would say any way to get that out there, just like what our friend Trevin just said, any way to get that out there, let's do it. Whether it's social media, whether it's sermons, whether it's, podcasts, or one-on-one conversations at a coffee shop, a church service, a large group gathering on a college campus, whatever way we can get that story out there is what we want to take advantage of. We have the greatest story of all time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that was actually Evan, but I was.
Oh, was it Evan? Oh, I gave you credit. Don't tell Evan that we quoted him. It'll go to his head. No, just kidding. Yeah.
One thing I found to be really fun lately in discipling young adults is I have a group here in Hawaii that I help disciple, and having times of just unfiltered Q&A, kind of where you have a topic, or maybe they are reading some material, but then it's more based on a conversation where they can really pick apart any questions that they have on it. Like having a space for that, an in-person space in your ministry, can be really fun and dynamic. And you can kind of do it by topics, dating or apologetics or this issue, and just let them get a few people that know what they're talking about in the room, but also let the sparks fly and let it be like a conversation. And Q&A is really kind of a fun thing to supplement to your normal discipleship and like teaching elements in your ministry. So.
Yeah, I love that idea. And you'll be surprised, like college students, high school students, even middle school students, they'll go deep. You'll be surprised by what they ask. And you might even have to pause and be like, I need to go do some research on that. Let me get back to you. Sure. So that's a great idea. Trevin, thank you so much for coming on. I know this will bless a lot of people. And if you guys want to dive deeper, like we mentioned in the beginning, Trevin is a part of it's the cultural, is it the Cultural Apologetics Tim Keller Institute? What's the actual title of it?
It's the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics.
Keller Center. Okay. Thank you so much. Anything else that, Trevin, you want to point people to?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you can find me pretty easily at trevinwax.com. I'll take you to my column at the Gospel Coalition. And then I've got a podcast, Reconstructing Faith, if you're into podcasts. It's something to listen to. And you can find different books and devotional resources and stuff like that anywhere you buy stuff. So
I love it. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. I know this has been a really fun conversation for us, and we could keep picking your brain for the next couple hours, but we'll let you go. But I just want to end with this quote. This was from Colin Hansen, actually, with the Gospel Coalition. And you mentioned this quote earlier, Trevin, actually, and it says, cultural apologetics helps unbelievers want the gospel to be true, even before they may fully understand this good news. And so we just hope that this episode has left you a little more equipped to show and actually tell unbelievers about the good news of the gospel. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll put all these resources, including Trevin's website, his column, in the show notes. And make sure you guys join us for the upcoming webinar in October with Dean and Sarah. We'll see you guys next time.